talk to people because we want to get some ideas about different findings, maybe some case studies that we can do to help us look at how different investments are going across in terms of the types of spending, where a trust fund is working, where other funds have been captured, so that we can demonstrate, especially going into some of the work at CBD in terms of financing for conservation, how it can work. Because interesting, this morning, somebody who was talking about that topic said, well, trust funds, you always want to talk about trust funds. It's not only about trust funds. And we said, that's right, it's not only about trust funds, it's about how do we use them in an appropriate manner, along with the need to put in investment, because there are immediate and expensive needs that can have to be covered. So it's really the question, how do we balance that? Where should we be looking at how that money is put together? What kind of financial plan? The fact is, if you ask a lot of people who run protected areas, so you have a management plan? Yes, I do. What's the finances and financial plan that goes along with it? Well, we don't have one. So a lot of people don't even know how much it actually costs to do a management plan. Because they're not worried about the dollars, they're just worried about the management. It's, because money comes from the government and you make do. So we have some gaps to fill. So this study started looking at some of the differences of advantages, disadvantages, some findings. And I have to read this because it's a little bit cut off here, but well, Conservation Trust Fund is a steady flow of smaller funding amounts towards financial sustainability. So the idea is to try to reduce, not reduce funding gaps so much, but maybe reduce some of the oscillations in funding. A lot of times many of us have been in a situation, oh, I get a grant, I have a bunch of money. After 3 years, we spend the money, and if there's no more grant coming, or if there's a delay, you have to lay off people, you have to stop funding things. It doesn't work very well. So the idea is to try to manage that. And the projects, they're time limited, normally larger amounts over a small period of time, and oftentimes there's not a lot of sustainability in there. And the thing about conservation funds, I know a lot of you that I see here have been in some of the discussions on biodiversity offsets and the issue of permanence and the management of money if there are payments going to be made. And I don't know what I would say about permanence, but I'm just kind of looking around and I see Alberto Paniagua here from Profonampe in Peru, and Alberto's going to have his 20th anniversary of the creation of the fund. So, and he's still going strong, right, Alberto? And, yeah, no. So 20 years of operations and building capital, significant amount of capital for this operation. I have another colleague in the back there, Mwine from Uganda, and he's going to be celebrating 19 years of the fund. So as we start to look at long-term institutional issues, it's not only about managing funds, it's about creating institutions, having those institutions be viable, be managed appropriately with transparent systems. So I think that's, that's something that's important. And one thing we haven't mentioned, because we didn't really put up the definition here, but these funds that we're talking about are non-governmental, they're private funds. They're managed by private boards. Now those boards may have government participation, certainly, but they are not dependent on government decision-making. Although most of those funds are linked into the strategies of the country in terms of meeting biodiversity targets, biodiversity conservation targets. So usually these funds do fund smaller amounts. If I have a $10 million fund, I earn 4%, I know how much I have every year. But I don't have a whole lot of money. But I can strategically allocate those funds if there's a good plan. Usually a larger project can spend a lot of money quickly and up front, or maybe not so quickly, but at least they have a lot of money to spend up front, can cover some investment costs, acquisition of materials, but again, the question is how long will that last? There's the potential for harmonization and alignment of donor funding. We'll hear a little bit about in a case study in terms of bringing funds together. There are lots of examples where funds have been leveraging a significant amount of funding. And then the project costs, you raise issues of harmonization and alignment of donor funding. Oftentimes it doesn't work as well, or certain donors will fund certain projects, and there's less cooperation. Funds also are less restrictive and more flexible allocations. That is, it's not a project. They can go ahead and fund the needs based on needs assessment, hopefully, and strategic needs. And you're not working toward a log frame, for example, whereas you may have a more restrictive use of funds in the project case. So what that means, if you're flexible and you have an emergency or something that it was unplanned that you need to cover, you can be more responsive. You don't have to go to, your board may have to approve it, but that might mean a phone call. You don't have to go to some project committee and say, no, it's not included in your budget. I'm sorry, you can't fund that. So that's a little bit of flexibility. The predictability of funding over the long term is pretty important, because you can create supply. And people will know that they can come and say, okay, we know how much money we have, we can put this amount of money in every year. We're pretty confident that we can use that money. The other thing that's interesting is that it kind of opens up other sources of funding. I don't know, some of you maybe have run into donors, for example, who don't want to finance administrative costs. They're willing to finance program costs. But if I'm sitting on my endowment and I can cover my administrative costs and I have those covered, I'm not so worried about not being able to cover those administrative costs through the grant that I've asked for. Whereas in a project situation, there is a bit more restricted use of funds. So I skipped that. Yeah, market risk is a structural element. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a little while, but these funds do put money into the market. And so if there's issues with money, with the international markets or local markets, and you could have a loss of revenue, you could lose some of your capital. And we're going to go to a little bit explain what we found out over time, what's happening in the markets. And then the risk that you look at in funds is that the project design may not take into account the absorptive capacity. Okay, so that's really important. I've seen lots of projects where they've been designed, they have to spend a lot of money, but the project implementing organization maybe could not spend that money well. We're talking about predictability of funding, the ability to procure. In the project sense, you're getting the ability to procure best international expertise and execute larger contracts for goods and services. That often happens. You can still tap local resources. The local funds, when you tend to do a longer term project, you're probably building up more local capacity. You're trying to rely more on local capacity to do the work. We talked a little bit about the potential to leverage additional funding from multiple sources. We've seen that on many different occasions. In fact, when we set up the Windy Trust back in 1995, GEF provided $4.3 million, and USAID then provided an additional $1 million, more or less, I think it was about $900,000, to cover the operational costs, to provide the funding for grants, and actually to build the institution, while that money stayed at the bank and got bigger in terms of getting returns and being reinvested. The project has co-financing schemes usually, and we probably have a little bit less ability to leverage funds, so they're maybe not be as flexible. And as I said already, local institution with programs run by local experts, long-term capacity built, and maybe benefit from local understanding, and project reliance on external sources oftentimes with experts with possibly less knowledge with local conditions. So, because you would really want to spend that money quickly, get the job done, and check off your outcomes. And when I say this, I know I'm saying really biased. Well, God, projects don't sound nearly as good as trust funds, and I know it sounds that way. And I'm not trying to say that necessarily. I'm just saying that they fulfill different roles, and you've got to realize what your objectives are in terms of how you use that money and how that comes together in a plan. And if that's done well, and we really don't have that many great examples, and that's why we're going to ask you later on, where are some good examples? Where might you go to study that? Do some case studies so we can inform people about what kind of mix do we need to put. because donors are concerned about the opportunity cost of putting money into an account to generate income and not necessarily do conservation. And people are afraid of the market. They're afraid that if I give you a bunch of money, you're going to invest it and you're going to lose it, right? Because the market's volatile. So we said, well, let's do a little study. So we've been doing a study since 2006 to see how these funds have been performing. And this gives you a little sense of that. And I joked yesterday when we showed this slide that if I just done last year's return, the returns from 2010 were 14%, would look a lot better than doing the 2% that I'm showing you right now. But 2011 wasn't a great year, but most of the funds are planning at 3, 5, 7-year cycles. A loss of in 1 year may not affect the fund very much at all. 2008 was a really bad year. The S&P 500 was down 36% or something like that. But if you look at the 5-year returns, it's 5%. It's not great. I'll tell Alberto, because he and I were talking recently in Lima. He's been going 20 years, averaging 7% a year. That's not bad. And if you have a few $1 million, multiple millions of dollars at 7%, that can generate significant financing to cover your cost. And having numbers like this and demonstrating how it works is not a bad thing, because, as we were saying before, there are going to be companies interested in offsets. Where do I put my money? Whom do I trust to manage something for the long term? Maybe there's PES financing, maybe there'll be a red market someday. And some of that money will be generated, where is it going to be placed? You can also see over here some benchmarks. So from 2011, where the funds were about 2%, our sinking funds were mostly invested in local and domestic markets and domestic fixed securities. We're generating about 4.5%. Compared to the MSCI World Benchmark of equities, that was down 8%. S&P 500 was just about the same. We sort of tracked the S&P 500 this year, the funds did, and the Barclays Aggregate Bond Index was about 8.4%. So we run through these indexes. We're going to keep doing this study. We're trying to make it even better, make it more web-based, and get a whole lot more information that the funds can share. We want to do more. We want to work much more with the investment sector, with experts, so that we can do webinars on investment, get people who are thinking about these things, can provide guidance to the funds, so we do a whole lot better job. We already have, there's a network of Latin American funds called RedLac, there's a network of African funds called CAFE, there's no network of Asian funds, so colleagues from Asia, we've got to think about what we do there, so that we can begin to exchange some information. We have some case studies, as Julien said, and Sahondra, who is on the board of the Madagascar Biodiversity Fund, is going to give a presentation, and really how that fund works as an advocacy organization. Because one of the things that we're finding is that a lot of these funds do act they as lobbyists in terms of policy, in terms of how funds get directed to protected areas. And so how do they bundle different funds together from different sources? All that is something that a fund can do, and I'm not going to get into much detail there because she's going to talk about that as soon as I quiet down. I already mentioned the Mungahinga Bundi Trust, Bundi Mungahinga Trust, sorry, and they have developed a finance strategy that's in line with government policy and in trying to address certain barriers. That fund really has become instrumental in financing communities around this protected area and gaining support for conservation in the area. And it's been quite successful in terms of both tourism has brought in a lot of money, these investments on specific programs in the region, And so gorilla populations have been increasing, which is really great. So that's a really good outcome. Right now, earnings from ecotourism are financing, you don't even have to finance this park as much as really subsidizing the whole network of protected areas in Uganda. But the Bundi Trust plays a big role in decisions on financing in that region. Eastern Arc Mountains Conservation Fund has received recently $6 million. So they're to do some work in the watersheds of the Eastern Arc Mountains. Their plan right now is to use that money over the next few years and just park their endowment, which began with a donation of $7.5 million from GDF. And so for the next 5 years, they are going to be able to just park that capital, grow their fund, and at the same time, invest significantly in conservation in the area. So this gives donors an opportunity to fund an institution that's well respected in their community, can deliver results, and at the same time really benefit the long-term financing of the fund. In fact, again, going back to Uganda, I keep going back there. I used to live there, so I probably should go back more often. But in Uganda, when we first set that fund up, after the USAID funding ended after 2.5 years, the Dutch gave 5 years of funding additional. So we went pretty much 6 years or so without having to touch the capital. And we grew that fund significantly from the 4.3 million to over 7 million. I will stop there, and we're going to have questions later, so I'm going to invite, please, Sandra to, she's next? Sandra, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, Julian. And thank you to CFA for this opportunity to talk to you this afternoon about the Madagascar Biodiversity Fund. We are also a founding member of CAFE, which is the African Consortium of Environmental Funds. And I think we have a lot of similarities that will probably come out in this presentation as well. So this goes for not just Madagascar, but a lot of our friends in Africa. So some of you know our fund very well, and some of you not at all, so I'm going to start, if you will permit, with just a few minutes describing our fund. In French, it's the Fondation pour les aires protégées et la biodiversité de Madagascar. We were designed to finance the protected areas of Madagascar. And in order to create us back in 2005, we had to change the law on foundations completely. They had to be revamped, and that was the trigger for our creation in 2005, and we got by decree public utility status, because the law allows for private foundations, but they must have a public interest objective in that, and they have to be given this status by decree. So there was a need for some political will for us to come to be created. And as I said, our mandate is to provide sustainable funding for the protected areas of Madagascar. Now in 2005, there were only a little less than 2 million hectares of protected areas, and one of the things I'm going to talk about is that has evolved since then, with the decision to triple the protected area system in Madagascar. But back then, it was calculated, and this was something that was raised early on, that for us to contribute to the overall financing of the protected area system in Madagascar, the ideal capital level was $15 million. And we have achieved that. We have, as of May 2012, with a disbursement from GEF of $10 million, we have reached a capitalization level of $50 million, and it's all been dispersed. In 2012, we granted $1 million in grants. It's our third year of financing projects within protected areas, because as you will see, it took us a little bit of time to ramp up. So this is just to show you the protected areas that we currently finance in Madagascar, and just to show also that those that are highlighted in yellow belong to the Madagascar National Park System. That was the system that existed in 2005. One entity that manages a good number of national parks in Madagascar. But the other protected areas that you see here are among the newly created and are managed by NGOs or BINGOs as well, big international NGOs. So with that evolution, we have come to fund more than just the Madagascar National Parks system. Our main purpose in this too is something about the evolution over time and institution building and how you have to adapt to new situations, is that we have just adopted a new strategic plan that puts